Good morning. My name is Tim Chen. I'm the board chair of the AID Board of Directors. Welcome to our third online community meeting. This has been quite an experience for all of us. We're learning as we go. So please give us a little bit of your patience. There may be some glitches. Joining me today is Deborah Cruz, who's our program manager for AID Northwest. Sarah Jackson, who is our featured speaker. Kendall Burke, who will talk to us about the plans for this coming fall, is how we're going to operate the Welcome Center. And then Erin, who's in the background, Erin Abbott, she will be the person that will make sure that it all runs smoothly. I read Sarah's book, The House That Love Built, prior to this, in preparation for this meeting. I was frankly pretty amazed at what she has done. I'm also a father of two young women, and I was a little frightened, frankly. My daughters are very independent and strong, but I think Sarah may have taken that to an extreme. I'm interested to hear her talk. With that being said, a little bit of housekeeping. We will have a question and answer session at the end. If you will use the button at the bottom of your screen to enter any questions you have, and Erin will read it to pick them and read them to the panel to be hopefully answered. There may be some that we won't be able to answer, but we'll give it a shot. Anyway, with that, I will let Deborah proceed with the introductions. Thank you very much. Look forward to this very fruitful meeting.
Thank you, Tim, for your introduction, and thank you all for coming. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I would like to tell you a little bit about how she and I met. I started my career with AID Northwest in December of 2017, and one of my first tasks was to improve our housing situation. The house we were renting at the time was in need of many repairs that the landlord would not take care of. Therefore, we needed to find a new hospitality house. I had never run a hospitality house before. Therefore, I started reaching out to other organizations to get some direction on how to begin. I was told about a woman named Sarah Jackson who ran a hospitality house in Denver, Colorado called Casa de Paz. I looked at her website, read all about the services she provided for immigrants being released, and I decided to contact her. She was so inspirational and expressed interest to want to help me to get started. I thought the best way to learn was to go there and visit. When I suggested this, she was more than welcoming. She offered to pick me up at the airport and let me stay at the casa. So after getting approval from the board of directors, I made my plans and headed to Colorado in January. Sarah very graciously picked me up from the airport. We stopped and picked up lunch, and with her and her assistant were waiting at the casa for us. When we got to the casa, I was greeted by her assistant, and we all sat down and ate lunch. During lunch, we talked about the many things that casa did for immigrants. After lunch, I was given a tour of the casa by her assistant, and she showed me where I would be staying for the night, which was actually a room that immigrants stayed in. It was a very nice, clean room, and on the bed was a welcome letter. I felt very much at home. She also showed me a room where they kept extra toiletries, towels, and clothing for anyone who needed it. I was very impressed at how organized everything was. After the tour, we went back upstairs and sat at the dining room to discuss what my dreams were for the new AID Northwest house and began brainstorming. Sarah had already drafted a list of resources and ways to recruit new volunteers because the house was going to need people to help with hospitality, transportation, and other duties. We spent a couple of hours discussing everything, and I left the table with a lot of exciting ideas for our own house. That evening, a volunteer arrived with a woman named Rosa, who was just released from detention. Sarah, her assistant, and I were all there to greet her and welcome her. We all hugged her and told her how happy we were to see her. She was given the same tour as I was, and after we got settled in, we all went to the living room where we sat and talked to her about the experiences that she had had and her long journey from Guatemala. She was very excited to see her family who lived in the area and was able to call them and talk with them. I could see the joy in her face as she was able to speak to them. The same volunteer who had brought Rosa began making dinner for all of us, and we all pitched in to help. Rosa talked about foods that she liked to cook, and I shared her love of cooking. So we decided to cook breakfast together the next morning. Rosa spoke some English, but mostly Spanish, so my Spanish came in handy. And I thought about how many more people I would be able to help in our house with this skill. There was another guest staying at the casa who joined us for dinner, and we all sat down to eat. The other guest was leaving that evening to the airport to go with family to another state. After dinner, another volunteer arrived to pick him up and take him to the airport. Before he left, the volunteers made sure he had snacks and clothing for his journey. He thanked them and hugged all of us and was on his way with a smile. Rosa and Sarah and I spent the rest of the evening chatting and relaxing. The next morning, Rosa and I got up and made breakfast for everyone. We made a traditional Mexican breakfast with eggs and tomatoes and peppers and onions and served them with tortillas. The host coordinator who lived there joined us for breakfast as well. I learned that he was a former detainee and wanted to give back to the casa for the way that they had welcomed him in when he was released. He had a full-time job but volunteered on his off times. It was very nice to see the friendship and love all around the room, and I knew that this was the way that I wanted our new house to feel. Another thing that I learned that day was all of the food was donated by volunteers. Sarah, after breakfast, I came to get Rosa to take her to a place where she would be staying until she could find her own place. We hugged. I wished her well and remembered her asking Sarah if she could come back to visit. And Sarah said, of course. She told Rosa about a dinner that they had once a month for past and current residents and volunteers, cooked all by volunteers. And she gave her a flyer with the information she needed to attend. Rosa asked if she could help cook, and Sarah again said, yes, of course. The volunteer made sure she had a change of clothes, gave her some snacks, and she was on her way to the new place. It was time then for me to start packing for my flight home. After packing, I looked at the notes from the day before, asked a few more questions, and we were on our way out the door to the airport. Sarah and I hugged when we got back to the airport, and I thanked her for all the help and we promised to keep in touch. I went back to Washington with a lot of these ideas and began planning the journey to find and open our new hospitality house. I am very happy to introduce Sarah Jackson, Director of Casa de Paz, who, as Tim said, has finished writing a book called The House That Love Built. I just finished reading it, and I highly recommend that all of you buy her book and read her inspiring story. I'm sure Sarah will tell you more about how to get your own. So here she is.
Thank you, Deb, for that introduction and for reminding me of our time together. Those details that you included are really special. And I'm also hungry now for scrambled eggs with tomatoes and peppers and a tortilla. Oh my gosh, that sounds so good. And thank you for inviting me to hang out with y'all this morning. I'm really honored that you would choose to share your time listening to a little bit about my story and what we're doing here in Denver, Colorado. I know there's a lot of things you could be choosing to do with your time, and for whatever reason you chose to be here today, and I'm very grateful for that. I want to actually start off by sharing, I guess I can't share my screen. So I am not going to share my screen, but I did have a picture of Deb and me at the casa, and maybe I can put a link to that somewhere in the chat eventually. But yeah, we have proof that Deb actually came. We have a picture. And I think I remember that second night actually, when we were cooking with one of the ladies who had just been released from detention, who was from Italy. This is one of my favorite stories because it was my night to cook, and I always cook spaghetti, right? Because it's like the easiest thing. And never in a million years would I have thought that on my night to cook that we would have a guest from Italy, and I was going to make spaghetti out of, the dried spaghetti and then sauce out of a can. Like, how embarrassing. But she was very gracious, and she was so grateful to have spaghetti, even with sauce from a can. And I remember she was teaching me how to throw the pasta on the wall to see if it stuck. And it was such a fun night for me. And I'm glad that your time at Casa de Paz inspired you to create some of the same sort of feeling that you got over in Tacoma, because it actually works vice versa now. And I'll get into this a little bit later, but your community has inspired us in Denver to open up a welcome center on wheels, which is parked outside of the detention center. I know y'all have an RV parked out of the detention center in Tacoma. So we just launched our Welcome Center on Wheels this week. So I think it's pretty cool that we are having a chance to talk. And we coordinated this meeting before we even had this van idea. And to know that this is our first week of having our van open and I get to share it with your community is really special for me. But let me just share a little bit about me and my journey of beginning this hospitality home. Tim, you were mentioning how you thought maybe I had taken it a little extreme as far as opening up my house for folks to stay. And I just want you to know you're not alone. When I told my parents about this idea, they were very protective and supportive, but mainly protective, I would say. And so I have a funny story to share about that in a few minutes. But I actually, it was probably about 11, 12 years ago when I knew absolutely nothing about immigrant detention. Nothing. On a scale of 1 to 10, I was at a 0, 100% of 0. Didn't know immigrant detention centers existed. Didn't really think about immigration. Didn't know too many immigrants that I, thought on a daily basis I came in contact with. It just wasn't something that was on my radar, to be honest. Not intentionally. I wasn't trying to exclude myself from immigrant communities. It just was my life. I lived in this little bubble, apparently. And I was living in Colorado Springs, and that's about an hour away from Denver, Colorado. And at the time I was working at a church, and I was the pastor's assistant. And one of my jobs in the morning when I got to work was to go through the pastor's emails, and I would actually respond to his emails. And then when he got to the office, instead of having 100 emails to respond to, he would get in to his laptop and he may have 2 or 3 emails that I didn't know how to respond to. So that was one of my daily responsibilities, respond to our pastor's emails. So one morning I get to the office, I sit down, open up my laptop, start going through the emails. And there's this email from Catholic Charities. And Catholic Charities was putting a group of pastors from Colorado Springs together to go down to the Arizona-Mexico border to learn about immigration. And not only immigration, generally speaking, but also very specifically as people of faith, as pastors leading faith communities, what is our response? How do we treat immigrants according to our faith? And so I read through the email, still nothing really jumped out at me, if I'm being honest. It was just another invitation that our pastor was being invited to, or another trip that our pastor was being invited to. So I checked the dates of the trip. I looked at our pastor's calendar. I realized he was busy that week. So I was responding to Catholic Charities, and I was letting them know, we appreciate your invitation. Unfortunately, we will not be able to attend, blah, blah, blah. But then, right as I was about to hit send, some words popped out at me in that invite. So nothing about immigration popped out at me. Nothing about an immersion trip popped out at me. Nothing about learning as people of faith how to treat immigrants popped out to me. What popped out at the very bottom of the email, it said it was an all expenses paid trip to Mexico. And I was suddenly intrigued. I love to travel. I had never been to that part of Mexico. So I thought I would just go on a free trip maybe. So I asked if I could go on that trip instead of our pastor, and then I could report back to him what I had learned. And they fell for it. They said, sure, come on the trip. And I went there. And we spent about 3 days on the Mexico side of the border and then 3 days on the US side of the border, just really learning a lot and speaking with people and hearing their stories and learning what churches and nonprofits and just individuals in the community were doing to alleviate some of the suffering that was happening because of our immigration policies and our border wall. But what changed my life, literally, was the experiences that I was having along the border with people who were personally affected. So I was meeting folks on the Mexico side of the border, like Abel, who had just recently been deported from his 3 children and his wife, and who had no idea how to get back to them. He had been brought to the United States as a young child, a baby, a literal baby, walked across the border. His parents were holding him. He grew up in the United States. He graduated from high school. He got a job. He was making money. He bought a house. He eventually met his wife, fell in love, got married, had children, started his own company, employed folks in the community, paid taxes. I mean, a contributing community member, right? And then one day he told me that he was driving to school to pick up his kids and he was pulled over. And not because he was speeding in a school zone, not because he was driving recklessly. He actually had no idea why he was pulled over. And the police officer said, you know, you are in a school zone and the speed limit was 20. You were driving under the speed limit. And the reason he was driving under the speed limit is so that he wouldn't be pulled over, because he knew he didn't have a driver's license and there was a risk of being arrested and then deported because he was undocumented. So that's why he was driving under the speed limit. And that's why the police officer pulled him over. They found out he was undocumented. They arrested him for not driving for driving without a license. They put him into a detention center where he was detained for several months. He ended up losing his case and then he was deported. That was the first time I had ever met someone who had been deported or had been in a detention center. And I was just a little overwhelmed, to be honest with you. But something very interesting happened. And I go into it a little bit more in detail in the book, but as he was telling me his story, I saw his face, but his face changed as he was sharing with me these intricate details of his life. Like he had 3 children, and I come from a family with 3 children. I'm the middle child, and I have a mother and a father, and he had, his wife and himself were parenting their 3 kiddos together. And so there were these things that connected me to him right away. And as he was telling me his story, his face started to change. It was the weirdest thing. And instead of seeing his face, I began seeing my father's face. And I remember thinking to myself, if this was my father, is that how I would want him to be treated? If my father was an undocumented immigrant and was simply trying to work and provide for my family, would I appreciate that he was detained and deported and separated from us? Absolutely not. And then, we spent time on the US side of the border, where we were meeting asylum seekers who were fleeing violence and persecution and war in their home countries and had no other option but to flee and to come to the United States for safety. I met a young woman who was pregnant. She was on the US side of the border. We were actually filling up water containers so that immigrants would not perish simply from lack of water, which happens. Thousands of people die in our borderlands, and a lot of folks die for completely unnecessary, well, all of them are dying for unnecessary reasons, but for a simple lack of having enough water. And so folks are dying from dehydration. And I met this woman who was from Central America coming to the United States for safety. She was on the US side of the border and at one of those water stations, and she was pregnant. And it was cold in that time of year. It was February and it was cold. And she didn't even have a jacket. She had a really thin sweater. And there were a group of about 8 to 10 immigrants that were crossing together. And they only had one blanket to share amongst the group. And I remember seeing this young woman, and instead of seeing her face as she was sharing these moments with me, I began seeing my sister's face. And I wondered if this was my sister who was crossing and was cold and didn't know where to go and was lost. Is this how I would want her to be treated? And every single time I asked myself that question, the answer was a resounding no, absolutely not. When I came back from that trip, for the next year, I spent a lot of time just wondering, what am I supposed to do? I know what I just witnessed on the border was not okay, because that's not how I would want to be treated. That's not how I would want my family to be treated. But what do I do about it? How do I make that situation a little bit better for the people who are personally being affected by the United States' immigration policies? What do I do? For the first year, I just wondered, I asked, I reflected, and I did a lot of saying no. I don't want to change my life. Like, I was really comfortable. Even though I was living in that little bubble, it was a comfortable bubble, if I'm honest with you. But eventually I got tired of saying no, and I said, okay, what am I going to do? So I moved up to Denver, and right across the street from the Immigrant Detention Center, I rented a 1-bedroom apartment. And I called it Casa de Paz, which means house of peace. And I actually modeled this off of another hospitality home. So I love this synergy that we've got amongst these homes across the United States. But El Refugio, I found out about them at a protest, actually, outside of the detention center here in Aurora. I keep saying Aurora and Denver. Denver is the capital of Colorado. Aurora is a neighboring city. The detention center is actually in Aurora. But sometimes when I say that, people don't know where Aurora is, so I just say Denver. And then I just end up confusing everyone. So anyways, I'm going to try to remember which city is the correct one when I refer to this. Anyways, I'm at the detention center in Aurora, and I'm at this protest. And I hear somebody say El Refugio. And this is right after I had moved to Aurora. I didn't still know exactly what I wanted to do. So I asked, I said, well, what's El Refugio? And they said, well, it's this hospitality home in Georgia, and they're about a mile away from the Immigrant Detention Center. And they open up their home for families who are driving in from out of town to visit their loved ones who are detained. So maybe there's a family in Texas whose father is detained in Georgia, and they want to come visit him. Well, El Refugio is there to welcome the family, to have a free place for them to stay, providing shelter, food, toiletries, clothing, basic stuff, right? They're in town for a few days. Then they go back to Texas after they've been able to visit their father and see him. Maybe it's been a year since they've seen him, or maybe they're coming in to say goodbye because he's being deported, whatever the situation is. So I heard about El Refugio, and I knew right away that is what I want to do. And I knew because there were 2 reasons that popped out. One, I thought this has everything to do with reuniting families. Creating a space so that families can see each other again, even if it's just for an hour or 2. It's still creating an opportunity so that families can be together. And then the second reason that I wanted to do this is because I thought this is going to be so easy. All you have to do is get a house and let people stay with you. Like, how easy is that? So easy. So I actually went down to El Refugio, much like Deb came to Casa de Paz, and I spent a few days there learning as much as I could, taking it all in. And then after that trip, I came back to Aurora and I replicated what I hoped to replicate, what El Refugio was doing. And originally 8 years ago, that was what we did. I lived in the 1-bedroom apartment. That's all I could afford. I was working part-time so that I could have the time to start Casa de Paz, but then also pay the bills. So I got this 1-bedroom apartment. I opened it up. I called it Casa de Paz, House of Peace, because when I was at El Refugio, I felt this overwhelming sense of peace inside of the home. So this family that I spent time with that had just driven in from Texas, it was very clear that this was one of the most traumatic, turbulent experiences of this family's life. And it was obvious just on their faces. But once they got inside of the house and we started to unpack together and have dinner together and play with the kids together, it was like this sense of peace sort of came across the home. And I remember that feeling was so special. And I wanted to have guests at Casa de Paz feel the same way. So I called it House of Peace. So I start this 1-bedroom apartment thing. And for the first couple of months, there were people randomly coming and going, people who were curious to learn more about it. And then, we'd have our first family. They drove in from Nebraska to visit their father, and then they left. And then a couple weeks later, another family came, and it was great. It was working. This idea of copying El Refugio was working. And so for the first couple of years, that's what I did. I stayed in this 1-bedroom apartment. And then when a family would come in from out of town, I would open up the apartment door. I'd give them the bedroom, and then I'd sleep on the couch. They'd be in town for a couple of days, and then they'd leave, and I'd wait until the next family knocked on my door. But then something interesting started happening. Because I was across the street from the detention center, I could see the detention center from my bedroom window. I was becoming very familiar with some of the guards that worked there. I would go over to the detention center to start visiting the family members of the families that stayed in my apartment. And so I got to know some of the guards, and they knew that I had this house right across the street. And one morning I woke up and my phone was ringing. So I picked it up, and it happened to be a guard at the detention center. And they told me that they were releasing someone, and it was a winter morning. It was a blizzardy morning. It was cold. It was really cold. I'm from Texas, so anything under 70, I'm like, this is freezing basically, but this was literally freezing because I think it was like 20 degrees. It was freezing. There was snow. It was, you looked outside, you could barely see anything. It was a blizzard. And this guard called me and he was like, Sarah, I know that you live across the street. You've got this apartment that you let families stay in, but I'm about to release this young woman from the detention center. Her family lives in Mississippi and she has no way to get there. She doesn't have anyone in Denver she can call, and it's a blizzard. Could you come pick her up? And it was a surprise because that wasn't the initial plan, right? The initial plan was to let families stay with me, not people who had just been released from the detention center. And like I mentioned earlier, I don't like change. I'm a very process, like get it, just here's your process and let's do it. Let's not change it if it's working. But there was a need, right? This lady was being released. And once again, I thought to myself, what if this was me who was being released from the detention center? Is this how I would want to be treated? And the answer was no. I would want somebody to come alongside me. So I'm going to actually just read a little section of the book about that first guest who stayed at Casa de Paz, who had been released from detention. This is actually one of my favorite titles of the book for the chapter. I wrote the book along with Scott Sawyer. Scott Sawyer is an author who has written books for other folks around the country. And he read an article about Casa de Paz a few years ago and then reached out to me and asked if I had ever been interested in writing a book. And I said, maybe, but I don't think I could do it on my own. And he said, I want to help you write this book. And he really wrote the book. My name is on the book, but It's just because the book is about my story, but Scott is a phenomenal writer. And so I love this chapter title that he came up with, because this is, I mean, Tim, like you were saying at the beginning, you know, just opening up your home to hundreds and now thousands of people. I didn't really know what I was getting myself into, but the chapter is called To Sleep with 1,000 Strangers, because I was literally sharing my house with thousands of people. So here we go. That moment when a person in detention is released may be the worst gap in the entire US immigration system. It's a crucial moment in a person's life and for our society. If you're a Christian and you remember Jesus's parable of the Good Samaritan, this is the scene where you come across the traveler who's been left lying by the side of the road, the one who's in desperate need but is bypassed by everyone. That's why I picked up the phone when ICE called. I'm an officer at the detention center, the voice said. We have a young woman here who is about to be released. She has on a t-shirt and jeans. It's all she's got. I glanced out the window at the swirling January blizzard. There's no one to pick her up and no place for her to go, the guard said. Would you be willing to come get her? My heart raced. Sure, I said, as calmly as I could manage. Awkwardly, I thanked him for the call and hung up. Wait, what just happened? ICE called me? The warden had probably told him to phone me. I was glad for that. Still, my palms were sweating. I was about to host my first guest from Immigrant prison. When I entered the lobby, she sat under the fluorescent lighting in one of the molded plastic chairs. She had a trash bag on her lap. That's what ICE gives people who are being released to carry their belongings. Her dark hair and skin contrasted with the sterile industrial white walls. She said her name was Flor, Spanish for flower. Would you like to come to my home, Flor? I have a coat for you there. Oh my, why didn't I bring a coat for her? Too nervous. I offered her mine, but she shook her head. Outside in the swirling storm, Flor didn't flinch. She walked calmly as if there weren't a wild storm tossing flakes through the air like an outdoor blender. Where are you from? I asked. De Guatemala, she said. I had learned from Anton Flores Masonette what life was like in Guatemala. It was one of the world's 5 most murderous nations. The police there don't pursue 95% of the crimes. That's because they're in league with the gangs that commit the crimes. Life was dangerous for anyone like Flor. Here, now, I thought about what might have happened if Flor had been released alone into the blizzard. She wouldn't even know which way to turn on the sidewalk. And that wouldn't matter because she wouldn't have any place to go and no way to get to her distant relatives in Utah. Not just a serious gap in our immigration system, a deadly gap. I thanked God again for the guard's phone call. So I, 8 years ago, or about 6 or 7 years ago, started then welcoming released immigrants to Casa de Paz. And that's what we do now. We have a home for families who are coming in from out of town, as well as we are hosting immigrants who have been released from the detention center. And then our third program is our Visitation Program. And unfortunately now, because of COVID, all of the in-person visits have been suspended by ICE. But we've kind of shifted, and now we are writing folks in detention through our pen pal program. And then once in-person visits resume, we will go back to visiting folks in detention. But what I'm super excited about, and I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is our Immigrant Welcome Center on Wheels, also known as Casa on Wheels. So on Monday, 2 days ago, we parked a van. It's a Ford Transit. It's not a big, huge RV, but it's not a tiny, teeny car. So it's kind of in the middle. And we're going to convert this van to be a really comfortable living room of sorts. And all of the seats are already taken out because we're renting this van right now from a guy who converted it to kind of be a camper van. So there's a little bed and some shelving, but there's enough room to stand up walk around. We've got all of the supplies that someone may need as they've been released from detention inside of the van, as well as space for our volunteers to sit, stretch out. We've got a hot spot so they can log on, they can watch Netflix while they're waiting. But we're parked right across the street from the back door of the detention center, so that when someone is being released and they're walking out, we're there right away to be able to greet them, give them a warm welcome to the United States. What was happening before is that immigrants who were released from the detention center, they knew that Casa de Paz volunteers would be there to pick them up, but we weren't there on site all day. We had a pickup time at 5 p.m. We would send a volunteer over to the detention center every day at 5 o'clock to pick up people who have been released. So if someone was released at noon, that meant they had to either wait outside or go back into the lobby of the detention center until a volunteer was there to pick them up. But that's no longer the case because we're right there. We copied your IV or your RV. Oh, IV. It's also a line of things that give life. But anyways, we copied your RV idea, and now we have our welcome center on wheels. Monday, like I said, was our very first day of having it open. We have now a morning shift where we've got morning volunteers and then afternoon shift of afternoon folks. Monday, there was only one gentleman who was released from detention. His family lived in the Denver area, so our volunteer greeted him. We had some cold beverages. Then he called his family. His family was there within minutes to pick him up. Then yesterday was my shift. It was my first time to hang out inside of the van waiting. And a gentleman who had just won asylum was released. And it was kind of funny because his lawyer actually emailed me in the morning and said, yeah, it was about 10:45 that the lawyer emailed me. And he said, hey, my client just called me. They're releasing him right now. I know y'all go at 5 o'clock, but is there any way you could do an earlier pickup? And I responded in the van. I'm like, actually, I'm right here. I'm just waiting for him. I'm going to watch right when he gets out. So that was really cool. And so this young gentleman was released from the detention center after being detained for 9.5 months. And what I really loved about our time together, I was only with him for a couple of hours, and then the next volunteer came and relieved me. But he was sitting outside under the shade of the van, and he was looking at the trees and looking at the grass. I mean, he was just staring at them. And he said, you know, I just haven't seen the grass and the trees for months because at the detention center here, all of the windows are blacked out, so you can't look outside. And it's funny, of course, like God has a sense of humor always, because I speak a little bit of Spanish, not fluent by any means, but I can have a conversation. But a language that I do not speak is Tiringa. I don't even know how to pronounce it very well, but it's the language that this guy spoke. He's from Eritrea. And so I get on Google Translate. Google Translate doesn't even have the language. So we're trying to have this conversation. His English was actually fairly good. He said he didn't speak a lot, but we could have a short conversation. But then, you know, it's that awkward after 30 minutes of chatting, right? Like, how much more can you talk without having a translator, you know? So we just put on music. I went to YouTube and I put Tiringa music, and he saw an artist he recognized, so we played it. And I got this really cool video. I wish I could share my screen, but I got this really cool video of the YouTube, and then I just kind of panned over to his foot, and he was like tapping his foot. He was listening to the beat, just tapping his foot. I loved it. It was just such a fun moment to share together. So as of yesterday, with this guy that got out, we have hosted, 3,124 immigrants from 77 countries. And Scott, the co-author of the book, he reminded me 77 countries is more than 2/3 of all of the countries in the world that have passed through the roof of Casa de Paz, or passed under the roof of Casa de Paz, and now under the roof of Casa on Wheels. And it's just really a unique opportunity that we have, especially right now in this really divisive climate, to show what goodness can come when we come together and we find similarities and we are sharing just everyday life with one another. So that's a little bit about Casa de Paz. I know that I probably talked for longer than I was supposed to. I just get super excited about this even 8 years later. So let's see. Am I just supposed to be quiet and see if there are any questions?
Thank you, Sarah. Well, actually, I was going to let Kendall talk for a little bit, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. Poor Kendall has to follow you. All right, you're on, Kendall. Tell us what we're going to do this fall.
All right, so I will be pretty quick because my stuff is a lot more boring than that. So as everybody knows, with the pandemic, we have had to change our RV Welcome Center operations a little bit. Right now, we have extremely limited use of the RV. We have a couple of smaller tents set up outside for people to wait in. Recently, we've only been having really 1 or 2 people coming out every day. We know that ICE is doing a medical screening as people come out as part of their release process, which includes a temperature check. So right now, with the current weather and the current flow, we're doing fine. However, we know that it's going to get cold and it's going to get wet, and politically things may change, so the number of people coming out may also change. So to plan for that and to get ready for that, we're winterizing our operations. So our current plan, as it stands right now, is to keep the RV capacity limited inside. We're looking at potentially installing some extra equipment inside of the RV just to make it a little bit safer, a little bit more comfortable for volunteers and for our guests. So possibly putting a divider up at the table so that paperwork can be done there without people having to breathe on each other. Looking at putting a HEPA filter in there to clean up the air for us. Outside, so right now, for those of you who haven't seen it, we have 2 little tent pavilions like you see at sporting events. But once it gets cold and wet, those are not going to work as well. So we're looking at installing a semi-permanent heated tent, like an Army-style tent, outside to increase our available space and make sure that we can continue to provide hospitality while we take precautions. We've already spoken with ICE and GEO, as well as the Tacoma Police Department, about putting the tents up. Everyone is okay with that. So right now, we're in the process of identifying the specific equipment we're going to put in there. So the specific filter, the specific tent, the specific heater, and we are going to create a full proposal to the board. That is, at this point, that's about all the updates, and I welcome any questions or suggestions.
Thank you, Kendall. I guess this is now time for Q&A. If you want to use the tab at the bottom for ask your questions, Erin will be the director. She will read the questions and we'll go from there. I'm sure a lot of you have questions for Sarah.
Looks like we already have our first question.
Okay, excellent.
Do you all have a rough estimate of how many welcome centers like CASA or Aid Northwest exist around the country? Does a mutual support network exist, or is it fairly decentralized?
Am I answering that?
Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
Okay.
I'm flummoxed.
Hey, Zen, it's actually a great question. And I think that it's loosely decentralized, but loosely held together. So I'm actually currently creating, and I asked my mom, who's a Casa de Paz volunteer, to help me create kind of a spreadsheet of homes like what Deb is running, what we run in Casa de Paz, El Refugio. I know that there's a home in Texas, in New York, in Chicago, in Arizona. I think but I don't know numbers because I just haven't put them all together. I just kind of know loosely off the top of my head. And we're also part of some other organizations like Freedom for Immigrants that coordinate visitation programs and post-release support hospitality programs. But I think, and Deb, you can chime in too, obviously, maybe roughly 15 homes around that area.
I think you're correct. And speaking of Freedom for Immigrants, they are putting together a like a support group for all of the different organizations that are helping immigrants. So I don't know if you've talked to them about that, but they asked if we would, be part of that. And so they're going to create kind of a website type thing. I'm not sure exactly how they're doing it, but that we will all be able to see what everyone offers. So that's something we don't really have right now. It's just, you meet someone. I met Sarah, and then I have her as an advocate for me. But we don't really, unless we're out there reaching out to find people that are helping immigrants, we don't know. And I think, I'm just going to say one of the things that COVID allowed me to do was to reach out to people because, we're not seeing immigrants in the house. So I've been using this time to educate myself on all the other programs that are out there. So I hope to see something soon come through.
Yeah, and I forgot about Freedom for Immigrants doing that. That's a great resource too if folks are wanting to learn more about immigrant detention in general. They have a lot of resources on their website. It's freedomforimmigrants.org, and they have these bi-weekly calls with visitation program coordinators, and then we have monthly calls with folks who are providing post-release support. So I'm really glad to hear that there's going to be a compiled list and maybe even a website so that we can be better connected. So Patricia asked where to get the book. I'm like the worst promoter of the book. I'm just surprised that I actually got the book and had it today. So thank you, Patricia, for asking. I'm putting a link in the chat and, oh wait, I just sent it just to the panelists. That doesn't help anyone. Well, I mean, it helps the panelists. But now I just sent it to everyone. So there's the link with the book. You can actually listen to the first chapter online for free. And then there are a variety of places you can buy the book, including some local bookstores that you can ship it directly to wherever you live. Let's see. What kind of outreach are you doing to churches, particularly evangelical churches? Interesting. I'm assuming that question is for me. One of the endorsements is actually from here, Robert, who is the lead pastor of the church that I attend, which is an evangelical church, Colorado Community Church. And this is his endorsement of the book. This book reminds us that immigration is about immigrants and that immigrants are people deeply loved by God. Sarah Jackson demonstrates with her life how we, as followers of Christ, stand with all people wherever they may be, from the womb to the tomb, from the belly to the border. And I remember hearing him use that line, from the belly to the border, in a church service about a year ago. And I started bawling, which is sad because it was such a rare experience for me to be, particularly in an evangelical church, but hearing a pastor get up on stage and say that using his platform. I speak in lots of churches, right? Unitarian, Mennonite, Episcopal, United Methodist, more liberal churches. But to hear someone use their platform at an evangelical megachurch and say that surprised me. And it shouldn't surprise me, right? Because as Christians, if we read the words that Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all of your heart, all of your soul, and all of your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Those are big words and big statements. And if we claim that title of being a Christian, of being a follower of Jesus, we have to follow those words. We have to. It's not optional. It's not if we feel like it. If we choose that title, then those are the words we must live by. And so I'm grateful for people like Pastor Robert who will use their influence. And we accept any invitation to speak to churches, evangelical or not, and we can cater the message to folks, right? Like, so if I'm speaking to more of a liberal audience, I may talk and use different language versus if I'm speaking with an evangelical church who might have never really engaged in the conversation of immigration. And one of the questions that we get asked a lot is, well, why don't they just do it legally? I'm supporting immigration, but just legally. And so we have conversations like that in the book that we talk about, well, wait a second, let's talk about that. Let's talk about an asylum seeker like Winston, who you meet in the book, who's fleeing genocide in his home country of Cameroon and comes to the United States after a treacherous 3-month journey, gets to the border, lawfully presents himself to a Border Patrol officer, following the rule of the law to the T, lawfully presents himself, asks for asylum, boom, handcuffs, boom, thrown in a for-profit immigrant detention center where he's waiting indefinitely, being held in prison where these private corporations are making billions of dollars of profit off of him. He did follow the law, right? So we can have these different conversations and with each audience. And I'm just grateful anytime somebody asks a question. I mean, and since we're speaking about churches here, it's a biblical concept as well, right? Would Jesus rather, in our scripture, would Jesus rather, or would God rather you be on fire or cold or lukewarm? Lukewarm is spit out of the mouth. God would rather you be cold or on fire about something. So if you're even addressing it and you're not lukewarm and you're not neutral, right? Elie Wiesel, he's a Holocaust survivor, and he says neutrality is taking the side of the oppressor. He was in a concentration camp. If anyone knows about taking the side of the oppressor or what neutrality can, the effect that it has, it's someone who survived the Holocaust. And he says, you're not lukewarm, you take a side. And so even if you have different understandings or beliefs, like at least let's have a conversation about it. Okay, anonymous attendee. Woo. Sarah, how is the CASA supported financially? A lot of ways. At the very, very beginning of the CASA, and actually there's a whole chapter in the book, it's called, let's see, it's just literally called Dive, because it's about volleyball. At the very beginning of the CASA, I ran out of money. I had a little savings account that I blew through. And then I needed money to pay for the rent, and I didn't feel comfortable asking for donations. And I thought to myself, how else can I make some money? And I love playing volleyball. So I thought, what if I start a volleyball league and I charge people to play in the volleyball league? They have fun, they get exercise, they get to de-stress after a long day of work. And then whatever profit we have left over from that volleyball league, I can use it to pay the rent of CASA. So I started Volleyball Internacional, which is a volleyball league, and folks can register to play. 7 years ago, we had 6 teams register in the very first season. Now we have anywhere between 70 and 80 teams every season registered to play, and we're able to make enough money to pay our rent. And we're saving money too, so one day we can actually purchase our own home. But then in addition to the volleyball league, we do apply for grants. Individual donors will find out about us. There was actually a church a couple months ago, or actually it was more than a couple months ago. Now that I'm thinking about it, it was last year. Oh my gosh, my brain. Anyways, last year they did a fundraiser where they made homemade soup, and then they sold it to the folks in their church. And then the profit from that soup, they donated to the CASA. And now we can use that money to pay our operating expenses. But what we're actually using that money for right now is to send a one-time commissary gift money order to all of the folks that we know who are in detention, so they can buy snacks or soap or a calling card to call their family. So there's a lot of ways that we're raising money, but originally it was volleyball. What a random thing, but it happened. Let's do. Jonathan, I oversee a guest house ministry at Bethany once a week, offer space, started, discontinue. What are some other ways I volunteer? Oh, Okay, so what are some other ways that volunteers can support our immigrant community during this time? So I am going to put here in the chat just some ways that we have been supporting folks without having the actual overnight guests kind of a situation. Some of them, you know, is using your voice, right? Like learning about immigrant detention and then advocating for asylum, especially right now. I think we all know, well, first of all, immigrant detention did not start under this presidency. We get it. This has been something that immigrant detention centers have been happening for decades. But I will say that under this current administration, the message in regards to our immigrants' welcome in the United States has been pretty loud and clear that they're not. They're just not. And there are things that the administration has been doing to try to push forward this agenda of closing off the borders. And now under the guise of COVID, they're able to push a lot more through, racist policies that they've wanted to do for years. And now they could just say, oh, well, we're doing it to keep everyone safe. So learning ways that we can advocate and use our voice. In particular, I'm not sure if y'all have heard, I think it was a couple of days ago, there was a whistleblower report of a nurse in a detention center in Georgia who reported that one of the contract doctors that provides medical services for detained immigrants has been performing hysterectomies on immigrant women without their consent, without their knowledge, and not just 1 or 2 or 3 times, but repeatedly. And that is shocking. Well, I'll say shocking in the sense of horrifying, but if you also can understand this country has had forced sterilization. We have participated in forced sterilizations before. This is not the first time that this has happened. So learning and then speaking up and calling your elected officials and saying, hey, push for an in-depth investigation about what's happening here in this particular detention center. That's one thing that folks can do. And then another thing that we have started thinking about is creating, specifically here in Denver, a community of folks who have been released from the detention center and stay in Denver, kind of like what Deb has done at the hospitality home. There are folks who are long-term new residents of the city that you live in, and creating an opportunity for them to be in community with one another because they have a very similar background, right? They know what it feels like to be in a detention center, to be released and in an unfamiliar foreign city. So we're looking at creating smaller groups of folks who have been detained and then released and now make Denver their home, and finding ways that we can accompany them in whatever it is that is most helpful for them, whether that's practicing Spanish or practicing English or Spanish, or learning job opportunities, or finding out where to shop for their local food market or whatever that is. And then there's other things in that link that I sent as far as other opportunities. Writing folks in detention. If anyone here is interested in writing with someone who's detained, you can be part of our pen pal program. We're actually writing now to over 10 different detention centers. So we can connect you to folks who are detained if you'd like to write with someone in detention. And I got an email. Actually, let me read it. Oh, we don't have enough time. Oh, I just talk so much. Big picture. One of our volunteers, who's a pen pal, sent me an email a few days ago and said, Sarah, I want you to know that I've been writing this woman who's been detained for several months now, and I've never heard back from her, which was fine, but I kept writing. And I finally got a response, and she wrote me a very short letter, and she said, thank you so much for all of your notes and letters. I don't speak very good English, and I'm very embarrassed, and that's why I haven't responded. But I just want to let you know that I won my asylum case and I'm being released, and that all of the messages that you have sent me kept me going, kept me waking up in the morning, and were a huge source of hope and encouragement for me. So thank you. So that's another option too, is pen pal stuff. Okay, I'm going to stop because are there other questions? I know. Oh gosh, there are. I'm sorry, I didn't see that. Oh wait, they're not questions. They're just recommendations. Yes. Immigration Nation, Mary, thank you for reminding us. That's a documentary series on Netflix, which very much surprised me that ICE actually agreed to letting people film their operations. But it is a very intense documentary series that's on Netflix, and really goes and shows the tactics that ICE is using to detain folks and how they're being treated once in detention. Thank you for reminding us about that. Okay, I'm going to stop talking.
There are a couple of questions were snuck into the chat. So one is, have you noticed any changes in the numbers of individuals who are successfully obtaining asylum?
Yes, absolutely. Judges now have quotas that they have to meet as far as how many folks are being given asylum and not given asylum. That's something new under this administration. So when you've got quotas to meet, numbers are going to change. Detention Watch Network is a really good resource if you're curious to learn. You can actually look at specific detention centers all the way down to specific judges in those detention centers to see what their approval or denial rating is. So you could actually go and look at Tacoma if y'all have an ICE judge or an ICE court there, or you could look here in Aurora and look at each particular judge and see what their record is year to year as well. So Detention Watch Network, they have a website you can go to. We
actually gather some of that data when we have the released detainees. We ask who the name of their judge, if they remember, and it is quite interesting that you only have a handful of names. We only see if people release from a handful of judges.
Yeah.
It's we're seeing the same thing. The number of people released is decreased significantly.
Yeah.
Also, asylum has changed because of the ICE agreement that people had to go through certain countries to claim asylum before they even reached the U.S. So we're not seeing very many asylum cases at all because of that.
Yep. Trump built a wall. I know you heard him say that in his rallies, build that wall, which he never built the damn wall. But what he did build was a wall of asylum seekers now that are stuck at the border. So there are currently over 50,000 asylum seekers that are lining the border of the United States with their legal right to ask for asylum. But because of the policy that they put in place a year and a half ago, remain in Mexico, they can ask, but they've got to wait in Mexico until their case is heard, which can be a year or plus. So he didn't build the physical wall, and the parts of the wall that he actually did build are already falling down. This is a joke. But he did build a wall of physical human beings who are now even more vulnerable because they're stuck under the elements. They're sitting ducks, high rates of violence and crimes against them, right? So you're spot on, Deb. There are a lot of atrocities happening to our asylum system right now, which is important that we use our voice once we learn about it to speak up and protect.
Erin, is there anything else?
There is another question. What happens when the house is full and more people are released?
Yay! When it's a full house, it's always a great night because that means lots of people got out of detention. What's happened in the past is that volunteers just organically will say, that wasn't the right word, will just naturally say, oh, there's not enough beds at the Casa, then I'll take someone to my house. I've got an extra bed. So in the past 8 years, over 20 volunteers have already done that. So we're actually developing a program we're calling Las Casitas, the little homes. So everything the past 8 years has been under one roof, Casa de Paz. But now because of COVID, we can't have 10 or 15 people spending the night anymore in one house. So we are developing Las Casitas, which is the little homes, which will be an opportunity for community members to open up their individual homes for one person for 1 or 2 nights. Same concept as the Casa, but more room for physical distancing. So that might look like someone who has a house and then a separate entrance to the basement so that the guest can have a little bit of their own space. So we're working on that. Right now, though, currently, when someone is released from detention, for the most part, we're able to find same day flights and bus tickets for them to be able to get home as soon as possible. We got some funding from the city of Denver to make that happen so that folks can get home and then start their 14 days of self-isolation as quick as possible. But yeah, that's an exciting thing too. Las casitas, the little homes.
That essentially has been our policy also, to try to get them on their way as fast as possible.
Yeah.
If they have to wait, we put them up in a local hotel for, until they get their flight, their bus, or whatever.
Yeah.
The concern is that having, obviously you have the same problem, 8 to 10 people in our hospitality house in this environment, it just doesn't work.
Yep.
It's not something we want to take on.
Yeah.
We are exploring other opportunities to, we have this great resource of this hospitality house, but we have to explore how we can possibly use it safely.
Yeah. We're all trying to figure that question out.
Yeah, right.
When you find the answer, let me know.
Is that when I bring out my crystal ball? And
Yeah, please. Where is it? Give me one.
I'll loan you my wand.
Oh, I like that. I like a wand even better.
All right. Anything else, Aaron?
It looks like we have one more. I understand that GEO has increased charging for commissary items, that we can no longer send things like combs. Is this true?
I don't know
I've
that.
never known that you could send things like a comb. We could, what we know, at least, I mean, and all the detention centers are different, even GEO detention centers, right? So GEO has hundreds of detention centers and prisons, and each one of them has different policies, which makes it really confusing. But here, particularly in Aurora, you can send in approved books, like if someone who's detained request for a specific book, they can request that, and then we can send it via Amazon to them. Do they actually get the book? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Each guard has their own kind of policy of how to handle that. But yeah, GEO does have their own commissary, which they charge a profit, because of course they've got folks that they can make a profit from and who need things like combs and soap. During a pandemic, you need soap to keep clean, or snacks or calling cards. So yeah, they'll take advantage. I mean, it's a for-profit prison company. Of course, makes a lot of business sense. If you're in this for the money, of course you're going to find every opportunity to make more money, right? Thankfully, Aid Northwest and Casa de Paz were not in it for the money. So actually, I know we're probably over, but let me just, if I can, just share one more story. So my mom one day was over at the Casa, and a gentleman had just been released. I think he was from I think like Kazakhstan. Please, I'm sorry. I'm really bad with pronouncing country. Kyrgyzstan?
Kyrgyzstan.
Okay. So he was right there. Yeah, we couldn't really communicate very well via Google Translate. So it was a lot of just like hand motions, right? Like time, like hungry, like tired. So my mom notices he's got this huge stack of papers from ICE. Normally folks are released, they've got some paper. So we give them one backpack to put everything in and it all fits. Well, this guy had a lot of papers. So my mom comes up and she gives him 2 backpacks. And she said, here, you put things in. And he's like, no, it's okay. And my mom, it was like a green backpack and a blue backpack. She's like, no, please take it. And she's trying to show him, like, put your things inside. And he's like, I'm okay. She will not take no for an answer, right? She's like, no, please. So he ends up taking one backpack and he's like stuffing all his papers in there, like cramming it in, barely can get it zipped. And I'm just like, whatever. Like, he only wants one backpack. Let him have one backpack. Well, then later at night, after my mom had left and all the volunteers were gone, it was a little quieter. We were upstairs sitting on the couch, and he gets the Google Translate app, and he asks me, he like puts it in the phone. He said, how much do I owe you for the backpack? He thought my mom was trying to sell him these backpacks. So I was like, no, we're not selling the backpack. It's a gift for you. Like, we're not trying to sell. It's not a store. You know, somebody clearly did not explain that this was a gift for him. So this guy, he's sitting there thinking my mom is like the worst salesperson in the world, like forcing these backpacks to it. And then once he found out that it was free, he ended up taking 2. I thought that was a cute story.
We've had the same experience also.
Yeah.
You know, how much it's free. How can it be free?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
There must be something here.
What's the catch? Yeah.
What's the catch?
Yeah.
Anyway, so Deborah, you want to respond to what we can take into the GEO here in Tacoma? I believe we do books, we do art supplies.
Right, we're bringing in books and art supplies, yarn, construction paper, pens, colored pencils, and that was just recently approved for us to be able to do that. But as far as sending things into the detention center, they're no longer accepting items from the outside except for certain booksellers, and I believe it's Borders Books. But when you send in those books, if they have to verify that they don't already have one of those books in their library. So if they already have one of those books in their library, they're not going to give it to the detainees.
Okay.
So, you know, Catherine, our visitation coordinator, and I have talked a lot about this, and, you know, we believe that it's much better served for the detainees if the things are, you know, brought to the hospitality house or, you know, bought on Amazon wish list, and then we bring them in since we have that arrangement with ICE and GEO.
Okay, is there any more questions or comments? Sarah, thank you very much. It's been terrific. There's one other. Okay, go ahead.
Oh no, that was it for the questions.
Okay. Sarah, thank you very much. I still think you might be slightly crazy, but
Most people do. I'd take it. I'll take it.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. We appreciate you talking today, and always a pleasure.
yeah, it's a pleasure.
It was so much fun. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
Go pick up your phone, Deb.
I
Gee,
know.
Deb.
Oh, you know what? It's ICE. I have to pick it up.
Oh,
All right.
yeah.
All right.
Well,
All right. Bye, everyone.
thank you very much, everybody. I'll conclude this meeting. It's been great to have you all present. To come back will be, I have another one. Next one is November. All right. Thank you very much, Sarah. Really
Bye.
appreciate it. Bye-bye.